This talk is titled Media Consumption Crises with no punctuation. Right? It leaves me a lot of room to maneuver. But there's really a question underneath it which gets asked over and over again in movements where people are concerned about social justice and ecological sustainability. Social justice meaning the relationships within the human family. How do we treat each other? How are resources distributed? There are many questions around social justice, obviously, in this world. Ecological sustainability meaning the relationship of human beings to the larger living world and to what degree we are in some sustainable balance with that larger world. And people who are concerned about those questions often ask what's more important, challenging the big systems or focusing on individual behavior. If I only have so much time, energy in my life, where should I put my attention? Should I be involved in movements to bring down the system? Or should I concentrate on myself and my own individual behaviors to try and make a better world? That's a question people often ask. And we'll get to plausible answers to that, but let's talk a bit more about this question of justice and sustainability and begin with a realistic assessment of where we stand in the world on the assumption that reality matters, yes? That we don't live in illusions of our own making, that there's a real world out there and we should understand it. Does that seem sensible? Okay. So in this reality assessment program, let's ask two very simple questions. One is, on the question of social justice, are wealth and power currently distributed in ways that make it possible for all people to live a decent life? You can answer.
No.
No, okay. If not, how far from that goal are we, and are we heading in the right direction? We'll leave a deeper discussion of that for later. All right. So we recognize that wealth and power are distributed in ways that are fundamentally incompatible with our moral principles, the moral principles we all claim to hold, principles around dignity, solidarity, equality. Okay. On ecological sustainability, here's your question. Are current patterns of resource extraction, energy consumption, and waste disposal consistent with a long-term, large-scale human presence on the planet? No, okay. And the same follow-up question for later consideration. If not, how far from that goal are we, and are we heading in the right direction? Now, remember, we said we were going to be realistic, yes? We were going to assume that reality matters, which means we have to start by telling the truth about where we are, the trajectory we're on, and the social forces that put us on that trajectory. In other words, we want to look at the data, the evidence about the situation. We want to assess the patterns, and we want to think about the social forces, especially the power, analyze the power underneath it. All right. So those are fairly simple questions that have rather deep implications if we answer them honestly. And if you let that sink in for a moment, I think it's clear what's at stake here. Now, because that's a difficult reality to embrace, there are people who take two, I would call them diversions. Both of them I'll describe as fundamentalist in nature. One is religious fundamentalism, and the other is what we might call technological fundamentalism. That is, if you look at the realities around social justice and ecological sustainability, you look at the distribution of wealth and power, and you look at the state of the larger living world, it's easy to be discouraged because the data is pretty grim, right? Roughly half the world's population lives in some level of abject poverty. Right? Half the world's population, that's more than 3 billion people, live on less than $2.50 a day, roughly, which means half the world's population does not have access to the minimal requirements for a minimally decent life. And if we believe the moral principles that we claim to believe in, dignity, solidarity, equality, that's a difficult reality to ponder. On ecological sustainability, I think all of the data, again, no matter what aspect of the health of the ecosystems of the world you look at, we're in a state that I think is aptly described as a state of collapse. right? That we're pushing the boundaries of what the planet can sustain if there's going to be this large-scale human presence. All right. So one way out of that is religious fundamentalism. You just say divine intervention is going to figure it all out because God, gods, whatever your conception of God is, has a plan. Right. Technological fundamentalism says, don't worry about it, we're going to invent our way out of the problems. That there will always be a new level of high energy, high technology that will save us. Right. I think both of those fundamentalisms are a form of magical thinking that don't deal with reality. In fact, they are diversions from reality. And if we are going to start with magical thinking, we're never going to have adequate strategies to deal with the reality of the world. So I'm going to argue against magical thinking. Right? The world frustrates us endlessly because the world is complex beyond our understanding. When we look out at the larger living world, we can understand parts of it, but we can't really understand the whole workings of the system. And when we deal with the human family, we recognize that we're all pretty much crazy, and it is frustrating to figure out how to devise systems to contain that craziness. Right? So I'm suggesting that we start with a recognition that one problem concerns the distribution of resources within the human family, and those resources are not distributed in a manner that allows all people to live a good life. A second problem is, at least in the high energy, high technology, more affluent segments of the world, a good life has been in fact defined as the consumption of resources in ways that make it impossible to imagine an ongoing large-scale human presence on the planet. I suppose in more colloquial terms, one way to say this is that the goodies aren't distributed fairly, and how we define the goodies is now likely going to destroy creation. That's the seriousness with which I think we have to attend to these realities. Now, it's pretty hard to deal with these without recognizing that at the core of this is a question of economics. There are other forces in the world that shape how we behave and how we connect to the larger living world, but certainly economics is central, and that means talking about capitalism. In a society that doesn't like to step back and ask fundamental questions about what is the nature of capitalism. But let's do that. I'm not running for elected office, so I can do that. I can actually deal with reality and tell the truth about these things. So what we know about capitalism is that it is a wealth concentrating system. It's an economic system. It's a system for organizing the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services that concentrates wealth. The degree of that concentration varies from time to time and place to place, but every capitalist economy has been a wealth concentrated society. And that we also know that wealth can and does get used to dominate the political sphere, even in societies that have meaningfully democratic political systems. And that wealth intervention into democratic politics can be an impediment to policies that might advance social justice and advance ecological sustainability. So it's impossible to talk seriously about this if we're going to talk about social justice without talking about capitalism. It's also impossible to talk seriously about the sustainability question without talking about capitalism, because capitalism is also a system based on the idea of unlimited growth. And that means unlimited growth on a finite planet, and there are some real problems with that. Any economic system that treats the world as either a mine from which we extract resources and a landfill into which we dump our waste, which is how the modern economy treats the world. It's a mine from which we extract and a landfill into which we dump. Any economy based on that conception of the larger living world is going to be, quite frankly, ecocidal. It is going to eventually result in the death of the living systems on which we depend. Right? Because, after all, we are organisms living in ecosystems dependent on living systems. All right. If you're with me so far, right, if you think that what I've just said is at least a rough approximation of the world, you don't have to agree with every twist and turn. But if you think we're talking about something meaningful, I think one of the next questions is, why in a relatively free society like the United States is there so little discussion and action about this? And I want to emphasize, we do live in a relatively free society. We have arguably the most expansive legal guarantees of freedom of expression and freedom of association in the history of this country and to some degree in the world. Right? Now, I'm not arguing it's a perfect system and that everyone's rights to associate and express themselves are treated equally. Obviously, there are differences in the way some people are treated. As a nice middle-aged, middle-class white person with advanced degrees and a professional position in the world, I have the sort of maximal rights to use. But I think it's important to recognize that in formal terms, this is a free society. Right? That we're going to talk about all sorts of critical things here with no expectation that the political police are going to burst through the door and arrest us, and that matters. Right? Again, the story of how we came to this position of relative freedom and whether or not it's a permanent condition, that's an important discussion. But if in fact that freedom does exist, we're free to express ourselves, to form political groups, why is it that we're making such little headway on these questions of social justice and ecological sustainability? We recognize already that concentrated wealth does tend to dominate politics. Everyone knows that I have certain kinds of political freedoms, and Bill Gates or the Koch brothers have certain kind of political freedoms, but that doesn't mean we have equal weight in the political system. We all know that money does affect it, but we also know that money can't build walls that are so high and so thick that people can't intervene, because history also demonstrates the possibilities of political movements not based on money but based on mass participation that have had important results. Right? So the question is, if we have those freedoms, if there's a demonstrated history of how they can be used, why are we still involved in a society with these deep injustices and a society that is deeply unsustainable? Right? Which is a way of asking, why are there not more movements and movements that are stronger to put forward these values that we claim to have around, again, dignity, solidarity, equality? And here's where I want to get to this question about the relationship of media and consumption. And to talk about this at the level not only of the macro. So far we've been talking about big picture systems, yes, capitalism, for instance. But also reflect on how our everyday lives are affected by these systems and what we might want to do about that. And to make it more tangible and concrete, I want to talk about two problems that I think are relevant here as we try and figure out why are we stuck as a society with rather expansive degrees of freedom, right? Consistent articulation of moral principles. Why are we so stuck? And the answer is partly, I think, about screens and stores. Right? The relationship to media and to consumption, screens and stores. So I want to explore our real experiences and what they might have to do with these larger questions about justice and sustainability. So here's the argument I'm going to make and invite critical response to later. We in the affluent segments of society, and by that I mean the first world, the United States, Europe, places where even if we are not individually wealthy, and I'm looking around and guessing that there is no one in this room currently who can claim membership in the 1%. Right? Anybody here in the top 1% of income earners in America? Okay, no. But we still live in a relatively affluent society. And my argument is that we spend too much time with screens and too much time in stores. That is, we are too easily seduced by a hyper-mediated world and a mass consumption world. And that it's worth thinking a bit about that. Not because we should forget about big systems, not because we should forget about capitalism or forget about other systems of power. like white supremacy and patriarchy. Right? Those are always going to be part of our focus, but I think we can learn something by attending to our own experiences that will help us learn about those larger systems and also help us think about why we so often feel stuck. Right? So I think that, in a way, what I'm arguing is two of the things that people think are so cool about contemporary culture. Right? What's really cool about living in the United States these days? Well, one is there's a lot of things to watch, yes? Endless entertainment, that's cool. And the other thing is there's a lot of stuff to buy, yes? You never have to want for anything, for the most part, as long as you have enough income. Right? So the two things that are often cited as the best aspects of contemporary culture, I'm in fact arguing are extremely dangerous. Right? Arguing against the normal way we think about what we like in the world. I'm going to, in fact, argue a point of view that's not new. It's not original to me. It's been discussed for a long, long time. Right? The way that what I sometimes call the cheap pleasures of empire, right? The diversions and distractions readily available to us in an affluent culture, often the product of that imperial culture, that way in which the United States is not only an affluent culture, but an affluent culture whose wealth is to some degree extracted from other parts of the world because of US domination of the world. People have been talking about this for a long time. Let me quote one of my favorite. I'm not going to tell you what year this was written, but it's from Lewis Mumford, who was a well-known critic. And it's from an article called Authoritarian and Democratic Techniques. He's talking about some similar issues. Let me just read this paragraph. The bargain we are being asked to ratify takes the form of a magnificent bribe. He's talking about the bargain that ordinary people have with the folks who run the world, sort of. He says, under the democratic authoritarian social contract. So he's recognizing we live in a democratic society, but he's trying to talk about the authoritarian underpinnings of that society, the way we live in democracy but are still controlled by concentrated power. He said, under the democratic authoritarian social contract, each member of the community may claim every material advantage, every intellectual and emotional stimulus he may desire, in quantities previously unavailable except to a restricted minority. Remember that some of the things we have access to, those of us who are people of ordinary means, were once available only to really the elite. Right? He says, excuse me, food, housing, swift transportation, instantaneous communication, medical care, entertainment, education, all things that we tend to take for granted in this culture. At least, again, if we have the income available to us, as many of us do. He said, but we get all of those things on one condition, that one must not merely ask for nothing the system does not provide, but likewise agree to everything the system offers, duly processed and fabricated, homogenized and equalized in the precise quantities that the system, rather than the person, requires. So he's saying that the attraction here, or the bargain here, is that we don't ask for anything the system won't give us, and we take everything the system offers. Right? Once one opts for the system, no further choice remains. In a word, if one surrenders one's life at the source, authoritarian techniques will give us back as much of it as can be mechanically graded, quantitatively multiplied, collectively manipulated, and magnified. That's a little dense in places, but I wanted to read it because I think it captures some of the trap I'm talking about. Right? And Lewis Mumford wrote this piece it was published in 1964, right, to emphasize that what I'm talking about is not new. It might take on new importance as social injustice intensifies and ecological sustainability becomes clearer. But what he's talking about and what I want to talk about is how we get trapped by the affluence of the society. And often without knowing it, we not only discipline ourselves to accept what's offered, but we also accept the compulsion to take it all, even when it doesn't advance our own interests, doesn't meet our own needs. Right? This leads to this concern I have about screens and stores. Too many screens, too many stores, and people too willing to fall into these traps. And I don't exclude myself from this. I'm not preaching from on high. I think all of us, even if we think about this, can recognize the allure of screens and stores. Right? How easily they seem to satisfy some of our needs. So let's talk about those needs. Right? Because those are attractive, those screens and stores, precisely because we do have needs that human beings have always had. For instance, the need to tell stories. Yes? Human beings are storytelling animals. We tell stories. Human beings have always told stories. Stories are part of what it means to be human, to share stories. Right? And one point of view would be screens. And by screens, I mean television, movies, video games, computers, handheld devices, all the ways that we take in these stories through this hyper-mediated world. Right. From one point of view, well, it's just more stories. Stories are good. Humans tell stories. What's the problem? But the question is, what kind of stories and how do we take them in? Right. The one area that I've studied most is the stories around sexually explicit material. I've done a lot of research on and organizing against the contemporary pornography industry, where there are stories told about sex. And working from a critical feminist perspective, we've looked at what kind of stories those screens tell about sex and what effect they have on the people who are using them, the nature of the stories and the effect on the people taking those stories in. And we can revisit all of these topics in the discussion, but my evaluation of the effect of the saturation of the culture with sexually explicit stories told through screens, that is a pornography-saturated culture, is that what it promotes is a disconnection from self and a disconnection from others. That it's storytelling, but storytelling that has a particular kind of effect on people, especially on the predominantly male consumers of pornography, since most of the industry is aimed at a male customer base. So are the screens which tell us these stories, which are really cool, by the way, I get it. Right? I watch movies now and then. Right? I enjoy the ability to relax watching a well-told story on a screen. Again, I'm not separating myself in some purist manner saying, well, I never look at screens. Right? The question isn't, do we use screens or not? The question is, what role have they taken on, and to what degree can we be oversaturated with those screens? And what are the consequences for it? And can we talk about that? Can we have a discussion about that? Whether it's in the particular realm of pornography or even more generally, because I'm not just focusing on sexually explicit storytelling on screens. Right? I think we've all noticed the way that the proliferation of screens has changed human interaction. Right? For instance, sometimes you can be talking to people and they will just be checking their phone. Can you believe that? Almost as if you don't exist. There can be people, oh shit, hold on. I have a really important tag. Okay, you get the point, yes? The way kind of insidiously those screens have come to affect the way everyday interaction happens. Is that worth thinking about? Is the way that we're distracted and diverted by the easy pleasures of screens worth considering when we're trying to figure out why we're having trouble building a better world? It seems to me a relevant question. All right, stores. I've suggested that the screens often lead to disconnection, a disconnection from ourselves. We lose track of ourselves and we lose track of others. I think we have to talk about stores and the allure of easy consumption and how that changes our connection to not just each other and ourselves, but to the larger living world as well. The way in this high-energy, high-technology world, the abundance of the world, again, at least those of us in the more affluent segments of society, has changed us and changed our relationship to the world. Here, I don't want to talk about sex, I want to talk about another basic human need, food. Pretty important, yes? We're sexual beings and we have to eat. All right. So one of the distinctive features of the contemporary United States and other parts of the affluent world is the incredible array and amount of food, and relatively cheap food. Right? If we were to take a little field trip to the local grocery store, right, and bring along with us people from the 18th century, right, if we could go back in time and pluck people from a couple hundred years ago, they would be amazed at the amount and variety of food available to us. Right? And they would also be amazed at how cheap it is. Right? Well, where does all that cheap food, where does it come from? Well, it comes from the earth, and it's produced in ways that are, I think, fundamentally unsustainable. That modern agriculture, which is based on petroleum, modern farming wouldn't exist without oil, the oil that provides traction, the machinery, the oil that is the basis for all of the petrochemicals, herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, fertilizers. All of that comes from an oil well. Right? All of it has made it possible for human beings to dramatically increase the amount of food we get from 1 acre of land. And because of the way the economic system works and the subsidies for that oil and the way that oil's costs are never factored into the price of things we pay, it means we have a lot of cheap food. And that seems really cool. Right? That meets some of our needs, but it also dramatically changes the way we relate to the world, the way we understand where our sustenance comes from. To the point now that there are lots of people in this world who basically have no idea of where food comes from, right? Especially people who grow up in urban settings, right? And have no idea of where food comes from and what it costs. Right? That disconnection again from the larger living world. And if we're not connected to each other and we're not connected to the world, if we are so easily diverted, right, so easily amused in a sense, does that dull our capacity to confront the world, the reality of the world we spoke about at the beginning? Does it undermine our commitment to coming together to try and change it? Are those cheap pleasures of empire so seductive that we can't resist them? I think that's worth talking about. It's worth reflecting. And again, not to criticize anyone in the room who's not living up to my standards, because I don't live up to my own standards. I have standards. I fail to meet them pretty regularly. Right? So I think these things are important, not because all that matters is our own personal decisions about how to live day to day. Right? I'm not arguing that we should shift our focus to think only about ourselves and our individual behavior. I'm suggesting there's a connection between the way we live day to day and our ability to mount challenges to the system. Right? And that one of the motivating forces to think about this is that in addition to the improvement it might make in our daily lives if we can disconnect from the screens, change our relationship to the earth through food practices, all of that I think has a healthy effect on an individual. Right? I know typically I feel better when I don't get lost in the world of screens. Right? Almost everybody's had that experience of intending to spend some short amount of time in front of a screen, whether it's a computer or a television or whatever, and then 8 hours later you pull yourself out and Do you typically feel good at the end of that? I don't. I usually think, what has just happened? I've lost control. What about food? Right? You have a lot of cheap food and you think, wow, that tastes good. And then at the end of that consumption, how often do you feel like, oh, well, that really made my life better? Right? Right? So reflect on Netflix and all-you-can-eat buffet restaurants to kind of make it tangible. So there is a personal benefit, I think, from reflecting on this, but to the degree we can cultivate other habits, other ways of living, and other ways of thinking about ourselves in relation to each other and stories, think about other ways of thinking about ourselves in relation to the larger world, I think we're likely to start being more capable of connecting with other people in social and political movements that might actually change that. All right. Now, I'm going to wrap up by telling a story myself of trying to make this tangible through the life of somebody who I think did as well as anybody I knew personally at living these values. Right? So far I've talked fairly abstractly. And often it's good to bring abstractions down into the reality of people. Right? And it's often good to reflect on people who might actually serve as role models of sorts. I am not that person. I am not the role model. But I was lucky to know someone who I still think about often when I think about how to make these choices. He was a friend of mine. His name was Jim Copland, and there's no reason anyone should know him. He lived in Minnesota, but more importantly, he wasn't famous. He didn't write books. He was not well known. He was, for some period of his life, a university professor, although he retired early and spent the last 30 years of his life as a full-time volunteer and community activist. He committed his life after early retirement to his community, which in this case was Minneapolis, Minnesota. He volunteered in political organizations. He volunteered in community organizations. He helped young people coming up. He participated in an arts organization. He tried to be part of the life of his community. Right? He had the critical political positions that I've been talking about and advocating. And he also had a deeper awareness than I've been able to manage about the importance of these everyday behaviors, these virtues and habits that we might want to cultivate. He had grown up on a farm in Minnesota, born in 1933, grown up on a farm that was really a throwback to an earlier era. He grew up on a farm. When he was born, there was no electricity in the house he was born in. His father was still planting behind a team of horses. Really kind of a 19th century world, right? A world defined by not that high energy that came from petroleum, but by different sources of energy, mostly human and animal muscle power. And on such a farm, especially during the Great Depression, you had to develop certain kinds of virtues around frugality and thrift. And he did that, right? As did everyone in that era. Right? But in addition to sort of habits about not being too much of a spendthrift, it also inculcated in him a certain reverence for the world, right? Growing up in that setting. So he had a resilience that came from learning to live without a whole lot. And he had a reverence that came from living in nature to some degree. Right? He lived on a farm, but around him was the kind of untamed world of rural Minnesota. And he managed to hold on to those values, to keep that reverence for life, both human life and life beyond the human species, and to stay grounded in the values that emerge from that. And he also cultivated these habits, these virtues of frugality. Right? Not because he was poor and couldn't afford. Right? He had an adequate income and was financially comfortable. but because he knew there was a connection between cultivating that sense of responsibility to each other and to the world to help us stay focused on the values of dignity and solidarity and equality that were so important. And he did that throughout his life up until his last years at the age of 79 when he died 3 years ago. So in the questions we're raising, screens, how did Jim deal with screens? Well, he appreciated the value of storytelling through screens, and he liked to go to movies, and he would occasionally drop into a movie theater. But he didn't bring screens into the house. He had no television, and he had a computer for only a brief period. He finally got rid of it. And he used it only for writing. The reason Jim didn't bring screens into his house is because he didn't like the way they changed his relationship to other people and to the world. He didn't like what it did to him. And it had also the benefit of then keeping those stories that come from certain kinds of sources out of his life. He also had an interesting relationship to stores. He went in stores. Right? He didn't grow all his own food or weave his own cloth. He participated in the economy. But he was very careful about how often and what kind of stores he went into. Here's an example of that. Jim was part of the 1960s. He was politically active during those years, and you probably know that that's the period in which music became part of the political culture, the counterculture. Music was a big part of politics back in the 60s. In some ways it still is. Okay? And so Jim was part of that generation that embraced rock and roll and the music of protest and all that sort of stuff. And he used to tell stories about, how exciting it was to wait for the new Jimi Hendrix album to come out and all that kind of stuff. But in the time that I knew him later in his life, I realized one day there was no recorded music in the house for the most part. He had a small radio CD player that he used to listen to the news and to listen to some music, but there weren't CDs around. And one day I asked him, I said, I just noticed, because he liked music and he went to musical performance, he had friends who were musicians. And I said, why don't you have any CDs? Why don't you have any records? Why don't you have any albums lying around? And he said, well, I like music, he said, but at some point I realized that records were just one more thing being marketed to me, right? That the business of popular music had overtaken any of the countercultural aspects. And he said, I realized I was just a target of marketing. And it wasn't that I didn't like the music anymore. He just said I didn't want to have that relationship to music. And so he simply stopped. Right? It wasn't because he was too cheap to buy a CD, because he continued to go to musical events and to support artists in the community. He just said, I don't like the way this changes my relationship to the music. And I thought that was quite profound. I haven't adopted either of his rules. There are screens in the house I live in, and I still buy recorded music every now and then. Right? But the point again isn't to say, here's the way you have to be. Here's the way this guy lived, and you should be just like him because he's your role model. That's not the point. Jim is a role model to me because he thought about this stuff, and he thought about it deeply, and he thought about it often, and he connected it up to a larger politics, and asked, what kind of daily lives do we need if we are going to stay committed to struggles to change the distribution of wealth and power, to change the relationship of human beings to the larger world? He was attentive to the way we can all so easily get seduced by those cheap toys of empire. And so that's the pitch I want to make, that this question I started with, what's more important, committing yourself to struggles against systems or changing the way you live individually, day to day? The answer is yes. The answer is yes to both, that they're both important, and in fact they're connected. That the way we cultivate habits and virtues in our daily lives is a reflection of our relationship to those systems, right? It helps us stay in more creative tension with those systems when we attend to those daily decisions. It is more likely to prevent us from getting lost along the way. And my friend Jim's life was one example of that, but my guess is you all have your own as well. So with that, let me open it up to not just questions. I'm happy to take questions if you have any, but also challenges. If you think anything I said was off the mark, please say so. And your own reflections. Right? I'm always interested in how people are dealing with these same kinds of questions. So with that, let's open it up. Okay. So the observation is that money does dominate politics in ways that we can no longer pretend. Right? I'm not a big fan of Teslas and the idea that electric cars are going to save us, but that's a good example, that a clear relationship between the source of money and a political policy. I think it's a fundamental challenge to the way we think and talk about democracy when we recognize the power of money. Right? So the fact that David Koch and I can only vote once in each election, which you could take to mean, well, we're equal citizens, right? Is a joke that everybody understands, because the Koch brothers and again these other incredibly wealthy people who are influencing the political system with contributions clearly dictate, if not the direct policy outcome. Right? Because giving money to politicians doesn't guarantee success. But I think what it does more than anything is narrows the scope of the discussion. I think the real importance of big money in politics is not necessarily what outcomes are connected to it, although that's often very important, but how it squeezes what we can talk about. Right. So take, for example, this fundamental question about capitalism and sustainability. Right? This growth-obsessed culture, right? That we always must have economic growth. Economic growth must produce more. Every year there must be more. How is that compatible with a finite planet in which we are exhausting certain resources and creating things like climate change that now really do make it hard to believe that the future is so bright you got to wear shades, right? So why is that not on the table? Well, there are the way in which money has constrained the conversation through things like climate change denial, but more importantly through simply making capitalism the default setting. So that even the one candidate in the current presidential election, Bernie Sanders, who identifies as some form of a socialist, is not socialist. It's a very strange election when somebody takes on the mantle of socialist like Bernie Sanders does, and yet proposes no socialist program. Right? Because all of that's been defined as out of discussion. And that's where I think money is really dangerous, when it keeps us from talking about things that are central to any decent future. The observation is that the assumption is always growth is good, and you point out that no politician, can you imagine a political candidate standing up and saying, listen, brothers and sisters here in America, I can guarantee you that if you adopt my policies, we will slow growth and achieve a steady state economy. Well, to me, that's what's necessary if there's going to be a human future. But the idea of any politician actually advocating policies that would slow growth and create what some economists call a steady state economy, right? When there's no endless expansion of more and more stuff, right, is unthinkable, yet it's what we should be talking about. That's one of those examples where the parameters of debate have so narrowed that you end up arguing about strategies to produce growth, not whether growth is good and growth is consistent with a sustainable future. Right? And when anyone points out that the limits of the planet might make that growth dangerous, we're back to one of those two fundamentalisms I started with, the technological variety. You point out the inconvenient reality of the limits of a finite system, and the assumption is we'll invent our way out of the problem. Right? which allows you to wave away the difficult question, which is exactly what this culture does.
But like a lot of
Okay, that's an interesting question. So do advanced technologies provide growth through increased efficiency? Sometimes that clearly does happen. Has that slowed the use of fossil fuels? Has increased efficiency decreased the rate at which we exploit fossil fuels? Well, there's an interesting, so let's take these 2 points, right?
Yeah, I know it's a fossil fuel, but also
Okay, I'm going to get to it. Right? So there's something called Jevons Paradox, which a guy named Jevons identified back in the 19th century. And he pointed out, this was in the case of England, when England was the industrial engine of the world, that as England got more efficient as using resources, especially coal and iron, to produce steel and other things, it was using more of them. Right? The paradox is that efficiency doesn't tend to decrease the rate of consumption, it tends to increase it. As we get more efficient, we don't say, okay, we've got enough now, we're more efficient, let's curb our habits. In fact, the dynamic seems to be exactly the opposite. So there is a real question about whether efficiency is going to get us anywhere except deeper in the hole. When we look for ways to, when we identify the problem of burning coal and oil, which are the dirtiest of the fossil fuels when it comes to greenhouse gases, we identify a new fuel, natural gas, right, which has less of a carbon footprint when it's burned. That's true. But we're now recognizing, and scientists are studying this, that in the extraction of that gas from the earth, there's a considerable amount of methane leakage. And methane is actually a more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. And its effect is more dramatic immediately. So that increased production of natural gas may well be exacerbating the climate change problem. Okay? So now, when that happens, you say, okay, we had this technology, coal and oil, and they were dirty, so we found a new technology, extracting natural gas, but it has problems, so we'll find a new technology. The point of the critique of technological fundamentalism is we have a history of creating problems through the use of high energy, high technology, identifying those problems and solving them with greater levels of technology, which have inevitably in human history produced new problems that were unforeseen. Some people call this the Law of Unintended Consequences. That every time we create ecologically destructive consequences from technologies, instead of stepping back and saying the obsession with growth out of which this technology came needs to be addressed, instead we find new technological ways to deal with the consequences. And is that in fact a downward spiral? My reading of history is that it is. Right? It's what one writer called progress traps. We make progress, we figure out how all this progress screwed us up, and we respond by more progress, which creates new problems. Now, there's no way to, it's not a mathematical question where there's a right answer and a wrong answer and you can prove it. But it involves a reading of history and a reading of human psychology and asking, is this the route to a sustainable world? You may disagree with my assessment that it's not, but it seems to me there are real questions about whether we can simply use efficiency and new technology to wish away the deep problems that are caused by high energy, high technology. Your question implies that storytelling happens in lots of different ways. Right? It happens orally. Right? People tell stories ever since we've had language. Right? The first big change in technology from a purely oral human storytelling was the invention of writing, which was about 5,000 years ago, when all of a sudden we could record stories in certain ways, rudimentary ways at first. And then there's the invention of the printing press, which dramatically changed the way stories are told and circulated. Right? And then radio, and then television, and then eventually the internet and all of those screens. Right? And it's interesting, at every turn people have been worried about the effects of those technologies. Right? And there have been people who've warned that these technologies are going to change the way we tell stories, And it's not going to be all for the best. And I think in some ways all of those warnings were correct. Right? That we now take printed material for granted. And most of us probably like reading. I like reading. I grew up reading. Right? But reading did change the way people relate to each other. Even writing changed the way we relate to the world. There's a big difference between an oral culture and a written culture. There's a big difference between a print-based culture and a visual culture. And all of them have effects, many of which I think are quite negative. But apart from that, right, there's also the question of degree. Right? The degree to which screens now define almost all of life. And when I walk across the University of Texas campus and see half of the heads down because they're looking at a phone, half of the people with earbuds so that the sound of the world doesn't penetrate, right? I think it's perfectly reasonable to ask, is that a positive development? Right? Now, it's early in the experiment to know, but I think the early evidence suggests that in fact there are these profound differences in the way we experience the world, and we should be cautious about them. I would actually like to go back to a world before writing. I think we'd be much happier human beings if we'd never invented writing. Right? Think of all the bad stuff that would have never happened if we hadn't invented writing. No, I'm serious. I'm more than half serious about this. Try to invent a nuclear weapon without writing. Right? You can't keep enough information in your head to build a nuclear bomb if you can't write some of it down, correct? If we'd never invented writing, there'd be no nuclear weapons. All right, there'd be a lot of other stuff we wouldn't have that we might like. But the point is that anthropologists and philosophers have pointed out that writing did change the way we understood the world. In some sense, writing robbed us of a sense of magic about the world, a different relationship to the world. And all of those things, I think, are worth contemplating from my point of view. Okay, so let's talk about the way a screen can not just tell a story, but dramatically change our relationship to ourselves, to other people. So I mentioned that I've studied the contemporary pornography industry. And I've done a lot of public speaking about it over the last 20 years. I've talked to a lot of people about their use of pornography. And I'll never forget one of the early talks I did on this, where I was, from a feminist perspective, critiquing the way pornography is constructed, the way it sexualizes male dominance. If you have any experience with the genre, you know that much of pornography is not just sexual, it's about the sexualizing of male dominance. Right? But it also has this profound effect on our sexual imaginations in, I think, other ways as well. And a young man who was in the audience, completely without, I think, an awareness of what he was about to say, raised his hand and said, "But I don't understand. If we stopped pornography, how would I masturbate?" Right? Now that sounds kind of silly, but he was serious. Right? It was a kind of guileless question. He wasn't trying to be a smartass. Right? In other words, for his entire life, his sexual imagination had been fueled by a screen. Right? And his ability to imagine sexual pleasure and alone to achieve that without the stimulus of the screen was unthinkable for him. Right? And I think I tried to gently remind him that people had engaged in that activity long before there was pornography. So apparently there was some period in time when human beings could imagine pleasure in a way and masturbate without the input. Right? But that's a profound change of one person to his own body because of the effect of a screen. Now, is that positive or negative? To me, I don't have any problem saying I think that's a negative development. The pornographers, I'm digressing a bit here, but the pornographers often tell us that they're opening up our sexual imaginations. And it seems to me the evidence is quite the opposite. That in fact this saturation of screens in that particular genre in fact closes down and constricts our imagination. Right? So stories are a part of human life. They're delivered in all sorts of ways, but it doesn't mean that all stories have the same effect on us or their delivery systems all have the same effect on us. And we have to tease that out and look at it and look at the evidence about it. Yeah. Right. Many people have pointed out it's almost become a standing joke that people, especially people with young children, their experience of their child is following the child with it used to be a video recorder. I'm old enough to remember VCR recorders. And you'd see these parents trailing kids at a soccer game with this big thing on their shoulder. Now it's, of course, all cell phones. But it's an interesting thing to go to certain kinds of events that involve children and look around and see how many adults are experiencing that moment by recording it. Right? And these are typically moments that are not, going to change the world, like whether or not an 8-year-old kicks a soccer ball one way or the other. Right? How does that affect us? I think it's worth pondering. Did you want to respond to that, ma'am? Okay, so let's pull some of that together because I didn't watch the Super Bowl, but I've seen some of the coverage of it. But there's an interesting set of questions there. So the Super Bowl is a spectacle that's now become part of the American experience, right? And that spectacle is part of this question I'm raising about the constant availability of spectacle does absorb a lot of attention. And I have nothing against football or games or throwing balls around to have fun or all sorts of things, right? It's not a set of observations rooted in a hatred of games and using your body creatively like that. But it has become this spectacle, right? Most people's experience of it comes through a screen, which means that other people are making decisions about what you see and what you don't see. It means you made reference to the Andy Williams narrative. You have to realize some people in the room don't realize who Andy Williams was or is. I'm not sure if he's still alive. He was kind of a milquetoast, middle-class white guy who sang really bland pop songs before rock and roll. Right. And there's kind of this all-American middle-class white image that is the Andy Williams image. And you're talking about the resonance of that, how it's still part of that. On the other hand, you have Beyonce, who premiered her video either that day or the day before, which has a race and class critique of some of contemporary America, yet it also has a lot of the conventions of pop culture that presents women as these hypersexualized beings. So there's both critique in it as it's one more time, reinterpreting these very patriarchal kind of notions about the female body. I mean, all of those things, that's an interesting example of the complexity of it. And you can point to things that are potentially resistant in all of that. But what's the effect of the Super Bowl? Does it add to the ability we all have to critique and engage in activity to change the world? Or does it end up sucking us back into this system? I don't have a simple answer to it, but I think those are relevant questions. Let's go global, yes? To kind of think about this in a larger context, and I think your point is well taken. So let's go back to the post-World War II era, right? And remember the potential. Now, some of us were alive then. I wasn't. I was born in 1958. Some of you were born much later. But remember that at the end of World War II, there was this sense of promise and potential. Right? And much of that sense of promise and potential came from what had been the formerly colonized world, the parts of the world that had been colonized mostly by Europe, to some degree by Japan, and by the United States. Right? This decolonization and this possibility. Right? And there was something that emerged in that era called the non-aligned movement. Nations that did not want to become part of the American alliance, but also didn't want to become part of the Soviet system. They rejected both of those. India was one of the leaders of the non-aligned movement, for instance. And there was a sense that there was another way that these newly emerging nations could craft economies and politics, right, that might offer different options. And that movement is largely over. Probably the world outside the US I know best is India, because I have friends there and I've traveled there a bit. And if you go to India, the political debates are not about the options, right? State control, capitalism, others. It's a capitalist world. There are people in India trying to resist the imposition of what they would see as sort of Western models, right? There will be a flare-up when an American chain comes in on occasion. But to a large degree, the values that we're talking about that underlie capitalism define India as much as they define the US. And that's a source of joy to some people who think they're, becoming fully modern. It's a source of great sorrow to others who see traditions being lost. Right? So I do think that it's hard, even minimal travel around the world, not to see that some of the worst aspects of the system that we live in, a capitalist economy, have migrated around the world. And that's a sobering thought. Right? And it asks the question, if we're not the source of the new ideas, and we look around the world and see that potential sources for new ideas are rapidly embracing the so-called American way of life, where are the new ideas going to come from? And I can tell you, the new ideas are going to come from America's community colleges, especially Austin Community College, especially right here in this room. The new ideas are here, brothers and sisters. I'm here to testify that each and every one of you at Austin Community College in Roy Casagrande's classes are the source of the future. If you fail, it's over. I don't want to put any pressure on you. But it is a way of saying that some of the things we've always assumed, like, the people from Harvard are going to solve our problems. I gave up on that one a long time ago, right? That it's in other places, small places where people have new ideas that they're going to bubble up from, right? And that's a weak attempt at an upbeat ending to an otherwise somewhat depressing talk, but I think a talk that's important because it at least deals with reality. And if it does seem like I'm kind of a cranky, dour old man who never has any fun, that's all true, but it doesn't mean I'm wrong, right? I may be a cranky old man who never has any fun, but I have a hard time imagining that any of us are going to craft a life that's fulfilling for us individually or contribute to a larger set of social and political movements that might take us in a better direction if we don't deal with reality. So that's my pitch. Thank you all for coming out and for hanging in for a long time. I brought a copy of the books I've written if anybody wants to see other things that I've done on this. Thanks to Grace and Jeff for filming. Thank you all.